conversation is around rumble with vulnerability. And I was saying to Mariana while we were waiting for everyone to join, one of the biggest challenges I had is this book is amazing that we're going to be talking about. It really is. And if you haven't read it, it's definitely a book to read. It's one of those books where you can't put it down. And I've ended up deciding I will do a section of the book each time as opposed to the whole book. And the first section talks to this rumble with vulnerability. And I thought what would be nice is if we could just start the conversation with a little bit of a poll. So if you go to Slido and you go to slido.com and put in the hash code of 372400, there is a question there that says, what do you need to give yourself permission to do, to feel, or not to do to show up for this women's leadership circle? And I'd love for you just to share your thoughts there. So what do you need to do to give what do you need to give yourself permission to do, to feel, or not to do to show up for this women's leadership circle? And if you can go there and just put your thoughts down. What is it that you want to get out of here? What is it that you want to give yourself permission to do? Sorry. Welcome, Tanya. If you can just go into slido.com and the code is 372400 and there's a question there. What do you need to do to give yourself permission to do, to feel, or not to show up for this women's leadership circle? I'm not seeing any answers coming up, so I'm just wondering if this thing is working. Are you guys typing answers?
Yes, it's a bit slow this morning, Shanti, so I'm only managing to get them now.
Okay, let me just try to go back into that slide. Usually it does this beautiful thing where it automatically appears and looks fancy. Today it's not doing that. Okay. If it's being really slow, maybe we must just use the chat and put our thoughts into the chat. Ah, there we go. Okay, permission to take time out for me, not to be working on the various businesses. I like that. Thank you. What else do we need to give ourselves permission for? Make time for me. So often diaries are filled by others needing my time. Connect with myself a bit. For those who've just joined the call, we're just doing a bit of an icebreaker. Join at slido.com and type in the code and answer the question. We've got a sudden rush of people joining us. Okay, I know which one's Selena. Ella's on the iPad. Make time for me. Any other thoughts on things you need to give yourselves permission to do in order to show up for the Women's Leadership Circle? Okay, thank you. I'm going to go into the presentation now. So for those of you who've just joined us, we are talking about Rumble with Vulnerability, which is the first section of the book, Dare to Lead. And we're going to go through some of the thoughts on that. So the first thing I want to do is take you through a quote from the book, which I really just love. The courage to be vulnerable is not about winning or losing. It's about the courage to show up when you can't predict or control the outcome. The courage to be vulnerable is not about winning or losing. It's about the courage to show up when you can't predict or control the outcome. And I'd love to hear from some of you, what thoughts pop into your minds as you hear that? What are the things that go through your mind? Come off mic, talk. There's not a lot of us in the room, so you're welcome to just come off the mic and share.
For me, Shanti, I think it's this fear of not having control. Very often we want to have a plan and we need to work to something that we're comfortable with and know what the outcome should be. And having that sense of control just gives us comfort.
It does, yeah. Any other any balls?
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind, I suppose, in terms of analogy with this is, look, I remember way back to school debating where you've got 3 on each side. And, it was really easy being the first speaker because almost 100% of your speech can be prepared. It's really scary being the third speaker because 80% of what you're talking about is rebutting the other side. So there's a lot of unpredictability. And I was always most comfortable being the second speaker, where you've got a mix of prepared as well as rebuttal. But that third speaker, nobody wanted to be third speaker. It's that whole fear of the unknown and not being able to have all your ducks in a row prior to, getting up there and delivering.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that, Selena. Any other thoughts?
I'm thinking about letting go, trusting the process, and being comfortable with being uncomfortable and knowing that that's okay.
And that's so important, being comfortable with being uncomfortable. Yeah. Awesome. Before I move on, is there anyone else? I see there was something in the chat, but for some reason I can't see it. There we go. Right, that was just Michelle introducing herself. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to move to the next bit. And in the book, Dare to Lead, when we talked rumbling with vulnerability, it's quite a tongue twister, and daring leadership. One of the things Brene Brown does is she introduces 16 principles of leadership. And what I thought is we could go through those 16 principles and talk a little bit about them. I put 8 on each slide. So I'm going to go through the principles, and then once I've gone through them, we can talk about what they mean for us. So the first principle is modeling and encouraging healthy, striving, empathy, and self-compassion. So healthy striving, empathy, and self-compassion. And I think that self-compassion came through quite strongly in the poll in the beginning, where we gave ourselves permission to be here, permission to be present, to have time for ourselves. The second principle is practicing gratitude and celebrating milestones and victories. Sometimes I think as leaders, we get so caught up in the day-to-day grind of the work, the things that we have to do, that we forget to stop and recognize how far we've come, how much we've achieved, the little victories along the way. The third principle, setting boundaries and finding real comfort. And I think as women in leadership, this is particularly hard, because setting boundaries in a world where we're working from home, our children are at home, we are living at home, it's very challenging, because what are the boundaries? How do you set them? What is work? What is home? And then where do we limit people entering our personal space, and how does that work? Because work is coming into your home each and every day.
There's a fantastic example from yesterday, Shanti, of this one. So about a week ago, a key global client got in contact and said, oh, we're looking at a grant and we'd like an independent report written. It's a fairly tight timeline. We're going to get someone to sort of discuss the requirements with you. And I said, oh, okay, well, when's that person available? You know, let's do it. And then I was trying to organize it for, you know, the Thursday, the Friday, the Monday, and they came back and said, oh no, that person can only speak to you about it on the Wednesday. So and I was thinking, oh, maybe the timeline's not that tight. So I had a call with them yesterday. And then they said, we need this independent report. We need X, Y, Z in it. We need this analysis. We need that. And this call was, you know, 1 p.m. And I said, okay, well, when do you need this report? Tonight.
What? Ish. And the question there is, how did you handle that? I mean, what did you do in that situation?
Well, it's a key global client and the grant's worth, you know, half of 530K to them. And we're about to recommence a whole heap of consulting in this region. So there's only really one way that you can handle that.
And I think that's the challenge also, is when setting boundaries, it's the conversation is also about when to flex and when not to flex. Because sometimes you do have to flex, sometimes you have to make exceptions, and other times it's like, not really, I don't need to right now. That's a fantastic example, and it's a very typical example, I suspect, with many of us in the room experience. Yeah. The next principle, practicing integration, strong back, and that's the part that's hard for us sometimes, being firm, soft front, and wild heart. And I really love that wild heart, because it's about bringing your heart and your passion into your work. I know Tanya is on the call, and she is so passionate about the work she does. Being a learner and getting it right. And I think this is such an interesting one, because as we get older, sometimes we think we can't learn. We think we've got to the end of that learning curve. And yet, no matter what we do, there's always something new to learn. It was so awesome hearing the delight in Mariana's voice earlier when she told us about her team's coaching and how much she's enjoyed it and how proud she is of achieving it. And it doesn't matter how old we get, there's always this opportunity for us to grow. Modeling kindness, clarity, and hope. Making contributions and taking risks. And this is not silly risks, this is calculated risks. But as leaders, we need to add value, we need to take risks, we need to do stuff. And the last one for this slide, before we open it to more conversation, is this using power with, power to, and power within. And it's such an awesome concept. I'm actually going to open the book and just read the definitions to you, because I really did enjoy them. So power with is all about finding common ground among different interests in order to build collective strength. So it's about building a team through mutual support, solidarity, collaboration, and recognition. Power to is about giving everyone on your team agency and acknowledging their unique potential. So believing in them, empowering them. And power within is defined as the ability to recognize differences and respect others. So having a grounded sense of self-worth and self-knowledge. So those are the first 8 principles of daring leadership. Selena has opened the conversation by talking about the boundaries one last night. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are in the room on these principles. What are some of the things that are triggered in your minds? Yeah, I see Tanya's written here, others often don't respect boundaries. And I think that's a very valid point. Any other comments, thoughts?
I'm reminded of Peter Block's work. He does a lot of work in building community. And one of his beautiful books is The Structure of Belonging. And in that book, he talks about giving an A. And he says, when we give someone an A, we interact differently with them than if we give them kind of a different grade. If you think of a child and you give that child an A, you're already saying you're doing well, you're doing your best, I love it, let's, you know, there's that energy, that positivity in the relationship. So I'm looking at the top one, modeling and encouraging healthy striving, empathy and self-compassion. And for me, giving an A to myself is something that I must remind myself to do. When days are dark and I feel like I'm in the desert, is to actually give myself an A and say, you know, you are doing well, you're doing the best that you can, so be kind to yourself.
I love that. An awesome thought. Any other thoughts?
Chantal, this is Anneke. Maybe from my side, two things really stands out. So setting boundaries, especially if you're just starting up a business, you really need to manage the boundaries, especially if it's new clients and a no comes and you really wanted the yes. How do you manage the boundaries not to get to the yes? I think that for me has been one big learning in the last few months. And also about being a learner, but being a learner in the sense of knowing when it's okay for things to go without it being 150% perfect. So that's kind of the things I'm thinking about as I'm looking at this.
Okay. Are you one of those that the 150% perfect? Are you one of those that wants everything to be all your ducks in a row before you go out there and do it?
Yes, I suffer from perfectionism.
It's a challenge, that though, because I think that's
it is a challenge.
It slows us down.
It does. You need to manage it.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you, Anneke. Anyone else? Francis? Nope. It's a quiet group today. Tanya's raised her hand. Yes, Tanya.
So I'm curious to know how many of the ladies here actually practice these things, because as I'm reading the points, I'm like, okay, fail there, fail there, fail there, fail there. And I, you know, for me, it's very difficult to acknowledge good things. I also find taking praise, but positive feedback, it makes me feel uncomfortable. It almost sometimes makes me feel like, did I really deserve that? And yeah, I'm not very good at practicing any of these. And when I started the new year, I committed that I was going to do this, and I was going to do this, and I was going to do this. And I find myself now, and I've kind of just let it all go. So yeah, I don't know. I really fail at most of these. So I'm just curious to find out how many women are actually achieving these things.
It's a good question. So this is what we potentially strive for. But how good are we at doing these things? How good are we at setting boundaries? How good are we at recognizing ourselves when we do well? How good are we at being firm when it's required and soft when it's required? How good are we at taking calculated risks and stepping out of our comfort zones?
I have to agree with Tanya on this too, Shanti. I think that looking at this list, yeah, I probably don't do a great job of many of these. You know, we would like to. You know, I think about practicing gratitude and celebrating milestones and victories. You know, I think of some big achievements, like even, one example is, completing my postgrad in psychology and my thesis on mat leave and having it published. And, I could have gone along to the graduation, and Ella was only, 1 year old, and I was kind of looking forward to it. And when it came to the event, I was like, I'm too busy for this. They're just going to have to send it out to me. I'd have to organize someone to look after her and this and that. And, I had work to do. And I think that if you look at all of it as well, like obviously we'd like to model and encourage healthy striving, empathy and self-compassion. Sometimes though, we're so busy that we, probably what we want from others, we probably don't give either, because we just trying to get it done. So yeah, that's part of leadership, I think, as well, really weighing up wanting to get everything done, versus, you know, having some time to reflect on these points you've got here.
Thank you, Selena. Michelle?
I think I'm in agreement with what Selena said. I think I feel the same, but I think my challenge has been mostly, you know, you see these, and it's common sense that this is what we should do. And I'll put up these goals or say, oh, let me try to follow this, and I'll be positive and all excited, and then sort of you get busy and distracted, and then half the stuff falls away again. And then, I mean, this session is quite good to pull you back and say, listen, this is important stuff that you need to do. And so hopefully, you know, I'll have a look at this and then I'll be into it for a few days. But somehow, you know, it always seemed to fall away or be non-important when things start getting busy. I don't know, maybe the other guys feel the same. That you have to sort of pull yourself back and reflect on the stuff that's really important. Yeah.
And I think what you're saying is true, because I mean, I also struggle sometimes. So I might, for example, yesterday I'd planned to go for a walk in the afternoon. I was going to fetch my friend's daughter, take her with me. And then an opportunity came up to engage with a client that I haven't had an engagement with, and to start building a relationship with that client. And then it's weighing up my personal time and my personal space versus my career and the career opportunity of building that relationship. And each time we have to make a conscious decision. And I think that's where we need to get, is to a point where we're making conscious decisions versus reactive decisions. So yesterday, if I think of the choice I made, it was a conscious decision. Whereas on Tuesday, when I didn't go for my walk, that was more of a reactive decision, because I had accepted more work than I had time for. So I had got myself into a situation where I was working and working and working and working, and I just didn't get through it all. And I think sometimes that's important, is we have to be conscious. So when we choose not to follow these things, we need to be conscious about it, as opposed to unconscious and it just happens and it disappears and it falls away. And I love Tanya's comment here. We need to prioritize ourselves. And ourselves is our whole self.
But don't you think as well that if something is related to work, you'll always make that the first priority, but anything personal, you'll find that an excuse not to do it. Like you using the reason for not going for a walk. But if it was a work-related thing, you would have done everything to do it. So I think our priorities are definitely flipped around, where we would rather have an excuse not to do something for ourselves or on a personal level, rather than maybe setting, because I mean, in your example, you could have always tried to arrange the meeting an hour later, or you could have taken a walk an hour earlier. But it's sort of an easy excuse now. Okay, I've got a meeting with a client. I don't need to go for a walk today. I mean, I think we all do it.
And you're right.
I think maybe it's easy for us to make excuses not to do something for ourselves.
No, definitely. Tanya?
So I don't know who else struggles with this, but I have a major problem with guilt. So I work hard, and I often work longer hours than, you know, working hours are. I'm committed, I'm passionate about what I do. But, you know, for example, if my daughter says to me, Mom, do you want to pop to the shops this morning? Just to go and do a few things. No, I can't do that. You know, I can't take the time out. And this is a constant battle for me. Whereas it's like, yes, if you take some time out, you'll be more productive when you come back. But it's a constant, for me, it's a constant internal battle, because, oh, you shouldn't be going because you're taking time out. Meanwhile, I probably worked those hours and then some. But yeah, but this is a big problem for me, and somehow I need to strike a balance. So I don't know who else struggles with the guilt trip when it comes to work.
Tanya, that's the reason I went part-time, because then at least I don't feel guilty when I do things like go for coffee with my husband instead of work, because otherwise I do the same. I remember I would feel so
not
guilty.
an option.
And it actually then it undid it. Selena.
Look, I'm wondering also if this is something that is particularly relevant to women and women in leadership, because, you know, Shanti knows, you know, I'll be on calls sometimes 10 to midnight, 11 to 1, you know, they're global calls, and you're probably guessing from my accent, I'm down here in Aussie, Australia. So, but, you know, I do feel a sense of maybe because pre-consulting, you know, you did that kind of 8 to 5 job or 8 to 6, and so you see them as work hours, and the others are just kind of additional on the top. But I do have some colleagues that literally unapologetically they put OOO in their calendar, so out of office, and if they had to do a call late at night, they'll get their mates together and go out to golf for 4 hours. And it's something that I just it doesn't enter my thinking to do that. And so I think it's really important, you know, to, you know, what's driving that, you know, why, you know, obviously it's that old thinking of the work hours at 8 till 6, but in this, you know, the way we're working at the moment, that's not always the way. So if you take hours at night, then maybe take a few hours in the day.
Yeah. And I think that stealing from here to put hours there is something that's a whole new concept in the working world today. I must say, our Cape Town office has now declared core hours, which is 10 to 3. So 10 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon, and then you flex the other hours around that. And I'm actually loving that, because it means that if I want to, if I've got a late night call, I can go for a bike ride first thing in the morning, as long as I'm there by 10 and back at work, as it were. So changing that thinking. And I suppose as leaders, it's a corporate policy thing as well. And it's something where we have to give ourselves permission, which goes back to the question in the beginning, is we have to give ourselves permission to do these things before they're going to happen. I'm going to move into the next 8 principles, if that's okay. And then we can carry on this conversation, because I'm curious to hear what you all think of the next one. So in terms of daring leadership, knowing our value, I think that's come through quite strongly, that perhaps we underestimate our value. Cultivating commitment and shared purpose. Acknowledging, naming, and normalizing collective fear and uncertainty. And I think in times of COVID, retrenchments, uncertainty in work, this one is particularly relevant if you are in a corporate environment right now. Modeling and supporting rest, play, and recovery. I think our conversation has covered some of this. Cultivating a culture of belonging, inclusivity, and diverse perspectives. Giving gold stars. Straight talking and straight action. And lastly, leading from heart. So as you look at that list, it's quite interesting. Knowing our value, that's definitely come up in the conversation so far. Modeling and supporting rest, play, and recovery. It's quite an interesting one, that, because I think if we don't model it, no one else will do it either, if we are leaders. And if our leaders don't model it, that's when we start to feel that guilt trip Selena was talking about, where 8 to 5 is work hours, and the rest sort of sits around that. So I'm curious as to what thoughts were triggered as you looked at the next 8 points in terms of daring leadership.
I think one of the things that's coming up for me, and I want to add to what you mentioned earlier on, Shanti, is the choice, consciously making the choice to do something. And what I find often is the language that we use also affects what we think and what we do. So sometimes we say, I want to do this, I want to do this. And if we maybe experiment with saying, I'm going to do these 3 things, maybe that helps with the action, activating the action, or is a catalyst, because I think language can be a catalyst to doing things rather than just thinking about it and you know, just milling around the thoughts. So I think conscious choice and language, how we speak with ourselves, I think that's quite useful.
No, that's very true. And I think it's exactly that. How we speak to ourselves will change how we behave with ourselves. Any other thoughts?
I think what I find quite interesting when I look at this list is that if I think about doing them in relation to myself or for myself, then I realize that I find that quite difficult. But if I think about doing them to model to my team how they can or should behave, or, you know, to encourage them to adopt certain ways of being, so to take rest or to know their value, then I find that a lot easier. So when it's for myself, it's really challenging. But when I'm thinking intentionally, if I behave in this way, then I'm showing my team that they also can, then that becomes a lot easier.
Interesting. So doing it for others versus doing it for self changes your way of thinking.
Yeah.
I like that. Any other thoughts? Frankie, you still there? We haven't heard from you yet. I think there's a Brenda on the call as well. No thoughts? Okay. I shall move on. So I think what is important with this is that we recognize these are things that we need to be doing. These are things that we believe in. These are things that are going to change how we are as leaders. The challenge is, what do we need to do to make it work? And one of the things that they talk about under Rumbling with Vulnerability is the concept, if I get my slide to move, of your square squad. And these are the people whose opinions really matter to you. These are the people who you trust and value. So you might get feedback from hundreds of people, or 10, 20 people within your circle of influence. But the reality is the opinion of certain people will always mean more to you than others. And it's not because that person flatters you or always tells you how good you are, but it's the person who you know to be honest with you. It's the person who you know that you trust their input, that they're going to tell you when you're messing up. They're going to tell you when you can do better, but they're also going to tell you when you're doing well. And in the book, they challenge you to write this square squad down on literally a piece of paper, 1 inch by 1 inch. So it's probably 2 names, maybe 3 names that you can fit on that paper. But I do challenge you to think about your square squad and to think about who are those people you need to go to and talk about this stuff and find out, how good am I really? Where can I improve? What can I do differently? Because that's something I think that will make a huge value to all of you. And it brings us to the quote on the left, which says we need to trust to be vulnerable. But we need to be vulnerable in order to trust. So it's a bit of a contradiction. Because sometimes if we don't trust those around us, if we don't know them well, it's very difficult to be vulnerable. And yet, in order to build trust and in order to build relationships, we do have to be vulnerable. We have to share who we are. And it's a leadership conundrum. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the concept of the square squad. Have you got those people, your go-to people that you go to for feedback, for insights, for mentorship? Who are those people in your circle? Is this something that would add value to you? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
It's interesting too, Shanti. You know, I think about the people that I trust to give me their opinion, and their opinion which I'll respect. And there's a few females that come to mind, and these females manage their boundaries so well. They are not necessarily always the probably warmest or empathetic, or how we, try to strive to be sometimes. And so, circling back to what you were saying earlier about boundaries, it's important to be liked, but I think it's also important to be respected. And so I respect those that have got really strong boundaries. And I think that's a good lesson to myself, that possibly having strong boundaries is actually something to strive for, just as much as we want to be seen as a good person or liked or whatever. We want to be a person that's respected.
Interesting. So the thing you struggle with the most is the thing you respect those people for the most.
Yes, that's a good insight. Yeah, that's true. Yep.
Interesting. Any other thoughts? Anyone else? Maybe the silence means that everybody is learning and not just quiet. I think one of the things I would like to talk about before we wrap up, though, is what do we do with this information? Where do we go with it? So it'd be really interesting to hear, having heard some of these thoughts, having heard some of these principles, where do we go with this? What do we do from here? What are some of your ideas of what you could be doing differently starting tomorrow?
Just to reflect on my go-to people, I haven't reflected on that in a long time. So I think that's going to be useful for me, is to think, who do I want to go to when I want honest feedback? So that's something that I'm going to look into.
Nice. Thank you for sharing, Mariana. Tanya?
Oh, sorry, my phone is ringing.
Good.
John, no, so I have to agree with Mariana. It's not something I've ever really thought about. I don't trust all that easily. And for me to be vulnerable in a way is showing weakness. And that's obviously dependent on the work environment that you're in. So to some extent, if you show vulnerability, it can be used the wrong way. So it's a case of, oh, you're too oversensitive, or this, that, and the other. So you kind of keep it to yourself, keep yourself closed for that specific reason. Because to open up is to, and you trust somebody, it's the wrong person. It generally doesn't end up well. So that's just my experience.
Okay. Interesting.
I tend to agree with Tanya as well. You kind of need to be really careful about exposing certain vulnerabilities to different people, whether that be in the workplace or personally, because it can come back or be used in a different way. Sometimes people are very strategic and they'll see that as a weakness to go for, and they'll have their own agenda in doing so. So yeah, Tanya, and I agree with you and Mariana in talking about, sorry, my little puppy has just made an escape upstairs. I'll just get rid of her if you want to go off to someone else, Sean.
Oh, that's fine. Pick her up. Okay. Michelle?
I think the whole discussion around boundaries, I need to maybe, the discussion around guilt and boundaries and all that was very interesting to me, because I forced myself to sit in front of my laptop from 8 to 5 because that's now my working hours. But then I'm stuck behind this damn laptop until 11 and even on weekends because, you know, you're working. So definitely the boundary thing is very important. I think we need to, I think that's definitely close to me that I need to definitely sort out. Because like I said, I seem to lose myself every time. So I think we need to maybe have these discussions and remind us more often. So have you looked at those boundaries? And yeah, and I agree with I think Selena said it about vulnerability, and it's a sign of weakness. And I think I agree, it's definitely the environment that we are in.
Yeah.
But you know, we need to balance, you know, it's not necessarily weakness, it's more sensitivity and empathy that maybe is required to be shown, rather than I think that's also some vulnerability, and obviously trusting. You know, if you start trusting people, they will also have the tendency to trust you. So that goes both ways.
Marla. You there?
Yeah, I am, and I am definitely listening, and I'm actually enjoying the conversation. And I'm really keen, Shanti, to actually get my hands on this book.
Fantastic.
I'm quite intrigued by the content and the conversation. Yeah, I'm actually enjoying listening for a change.
Awesome. And who hasn't spoken yet? Brenda.
Hello, everyone.
Ah.
I am here. I've been listening in. I'm dialed in this morning. Wasn't sure what the conversation was about, so I was really just trying to wrap my head around the conversation. That's why I was doing more listening than anything else. So I think really good conversations around the table. Feeling extremely encouraged and inspired to also get the book, as Marla said. And my journey is very different, but I think just listening around the table, I've just come out of corporate and sort of taken a break and have obviously been in a leadership role and can absolutely identify with everyone around the table in terms of where they're at. So I think as I now step into the next, leg of my journey, just the conversation around the Square Squad, I'm just evaluating my Square Squad has to almost change, because as I change and as I diversify my portfolio, it means the conversations also begin to change. So that was a huge takeaway for me, because with where I am now and what I'm doing now, that sort of squad needs to change, because I've always had mentors, sponsors that I've always been very vulnerable around. And I think for me, vulnerability has always been a strength for me. So I found that in my journey and my career, being vulnerable has always been my biggest strength. So yeah, just interesting to hear everybody else's views as well.
Thank you, and welcome. I think this was your first visit to our circle.
Yeah.
Okay, Laura, you haven't spoken in a while.
Yeah, I think for me as well, it's just been interesting hearing everyone else's views and experiences. And I guess I come from quite a different sector as well, maybe a little like Brenda. I'm in the charity sector. It can be a little easier, I think, to be vulnerable. I've just started a new role, and that's been really interesting. Trying to think more intentionally about how I position myself in that way, trying to be more authentic. So I think for me, what I'll be taking away from today is, trying to more intentionally adopt some of those leadership practices, because I feel I've got a real opportunity to do that coming into this new role. I haven't yet solidified, how I'm going to be. So it feels like a great opportunity, I think.
Awesome. Thank you, Laura. And congratulations on the new role. I know you're excited about it. Who haven't we heard from? I'm just going through the list. Selena, I think you're the last one because you vanished. Oh, no, and Annika as well.
Yes, sorry, I did vanish off there to take the stinky little puppy downstairs. So she needs a bath tomorrow. I think, yes, it can be interesting. I think, trying to weigh up how vulnerable to be in certain situations and what you're looking to achieve from that. If you're sharing something that is quite sensitive in the workplace, or something that you think will maybe have an impact on things. If you're looking for compassionate understanding, but you're not necessarily going to get that, do you still share? How vulnerable do you be in certain situations? And ultimately, looking at, rather than sharing for the sake of sharing, knowing sort of what you want from actually sharing that piece of information, I think is key as well. And that can be from a point of view of to our leaders or as us as leaders. So if someone comes to us and they share something, about themselves that's quite sensitive, being able to ask that question, thank you for sharing this. What are you hoping that we or I as a leader can do? I think is important as well.
Thank you.
Maybe Shanti, from my side, maybe slightly different, but somewhat of the same. I think one of my biggest realizations leaving a corporate career and starting your own private practice or going into entrepreneurship role, whatever else that you do, is that your boundaries and the relationships with people that were in this huge business that you were part of changes significantly. And also your square squad changes, but you don't necessarily consciously realize it until some or other interactions happen. And then you start to understand, but those boundaries and your square squad no longer exists of people that you thought might be in it. So when you do make a change, or even if you just start a new job, I think there's an enormous amount of value in actually going to go and sit and consciously say, who is now in your square squad? And are you 100% certain that they are actually in there? I think for me, this has been one of the biggest realizations, and some of them were quite sad, how this changes for you, especially for the ladies in new roles. Be very conscious, I think this book could add a lot of value in being really conscious and specific about how you plan your next few months in a new job.
I think that's true. And just to build on that, I think when we think about, that square that you talked about, Shanti, and the people that we go to for advice, do they also come to us for advice? And vice versa, if you flip it, there's a lot of people that come to me for advice, but there's no way I would go to them if I needed advice. There's certain people that come to me for advice that may respect my opinion, but I don't necessarily consider them in that square of people that I would go to. And then also vice versa, when you look at it, there's certain people, like including my older sister, with fantastic boundaries, like too good boundaries, really. I probably never want boundaries as bounded as hers. She's great, but I go to her, really respect her. But I do get a bit offended because she doesn't always come to me. I don't know if I'm in her square. She's got a very elite square. So that whole thinking, do the people that come to us also need to be the people that we go to? Or is there's different squares there?
That's an interesting question. And I suppose what we look for in our square might be different to what other people look for in their square. And yeah, I suppose we all have different needs in terms of that square and different kinds of feedback, but it's a very interesting question. It really is. Okay. I am conscious of time, and I think Tanya's dropped off, and Marla. I have just put into the chat a link to the Brene Brown resources, etc., and the meeting. If you don't have it in your calendar for the rest of the year, there is a meeting link there and my email address. Just to share one last screen It'll be there. Is just so you are all aware, the next one will obviously be the next third Thursday of the month, which we've now moved so that Selena doesn't have to stay up late on Friday nights. And next month, I thought what we'll do is we'll go living into our values. So the second section of the book is about values. And hopefully this conversation will be built upon. So I'm hoping we'll see you all back next time. Obviously, not everyone can be available to do everything. But at this point in time, that is the plan for June. So I look forward to seeing you there. If any of you want to chat further, I do offer coaching services, small business coaching, career coaching, CV writing, interview prep services. So yeah, those are just additional add-ons if you want to chat about any of those things. But my details are in the comments. If any of you aren't on my mailing list and want to be added, also just put your email address into the chat and I will add you to the list according to all these lovely new acts. And we don't want to do it unless you give me permission.